Hey guys, how's it hanging? So this video is actually part 2 of the amazing conversation that I had with the one and only Matt vs. Japan. We touched upon the pros and cons of learning one language versus learning a bunch of them, and most importantly, which path is right for you. So if you haven't seen the last video that we made together talking about how you can go about mastering any language, you can check it out right around here somewhere. And enjoy the video. Have you thought about taking on multiple languages? I know that you studied Mandarin for a while, and obviously there are many different kinds of language learners, right? You have the Matt vs. Japan and the Xiaomas of the world, who tend to focus heavily on one language. And then you have people kind of in the middle that like to take a bunch of languages to an upper intermediate, maybe advanced level like Luca. And then you have people like Fauter and Lao Shu, just like to mess around in a bunch of them, but also learn some languages to a good level. So I guess my question is,
why did I land in the category that I landed?
Exactly. Why did you land in that first category?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and it's something I think about a lot because I think when I look at the current language learning landscape, my type, the person who wants to go really deep on one language, doesn't seem to be the majority. They seem to be almost a minority. And so I always kind of an interesting perspective being almost a minority. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe there's more people like like me than I think. But yeah, I mean, for me personally, I guess part of it comes from that Japanese was like my first passion when it comes to language. And so I guess the more that I learn, the more that I know that I don't know. And so it feels like, well, there's still so much I haven't learned yet in Japanese. Even though, of course, I'm at a high level of fluency, the farther I go in with Japanese, the less I think of myself as a foreigner who's learning Japanese and more as just a speaker of the Japanese language. And when I view myself as a speaker of the Japanese language, I realize there's so many cultural references that I don't get, so much like technical vocabulary that I would understand in English, but not in Japanese. You know, so many more technical topics I can't talk about as freely as I'd like. And so it kind of feels like, well, that's the most important thing for me to learn is to keep getting better at Japanese because I've gone so deep in the Japanese language and it's become so much of my life. I assume I feel that I'm going to continue to have Japanese be a big part of my life for the rest of my life. And so if that's going to be the case, I don't want to keep having all these gaps in my knowledge where there's some TV show that everyone else, every other Japanese speaker knows and references, but I don't know it because I didn't grow up in Japan. So it feels like in a way I have these like very minor, I wouldn't say handicaps, it's kind of extreme, but just when I compare it to my English ability or to a Japanese person where I'm not 100% equivalent. And so if I'm going to keep being a speaker of Japanese for the rest of my life, I don't want that to be the case. I want to be 100% equivalent. And so when I take that lens, there's still so much more to learn. Right, so many more topics to explore, and also just I kind of feel that the more that I understand Japanese, the more my experience of using Japanese and being with Japanese is enriched. So I want to learn even more about the literature, more about the history, more about classical Japanese, because all of that enriches my whole experience. But I guess I just kind of feel like the more I put in, the more I get out. So why would I I guess I am interested in learning other languages, but the biggest thing is like time is limited. So it feels like if I tried to spread myself out, I wouldn't be able to go as deep in Japanese as I want to throughout the rest of my life. So I just have to make the sacrifice and go all in Japanese. If that makes sense.
And is that what primarily drives you, this comparison to your native language, that you're still not as good in Japanese as you are in your native language, so you always see room for improvement?
I wouldn't say it's the major thing, because actually I want to improve in English as well. So it's not like I'm viewing my English as the goal line and trying to get my Japanese caught up. But I mean, it is something that I take into account because, you know, if I have a conversation about a topic in English and then a conversation about the same topic in Japanese, and it felt like I was able to get my point across better in English, or it was more effortless in English, then it's kind of like I'm having a inferior experience in Japanese. And I don't want to have an inferior experience in Japanese. I want to have the best possible experience because I love Japanese and I'm going to be spending my time in Japanese. So I want, you know, it's my life, right? I'm spending so much of my life in Japanese. So I want all those, you know, hours that I spend in my life to be the best possible experience. So I guess it's an easy comparison, but even if my Japanese gets as good as my English, I'll probably still want to keep improving because I kind of think in everything in life, when you're not getting better, you're getting worse. So I try to always have that growth mindset, never get complacent.
Yes, never get complacent. And I encounter words in English every single day that
same
that I've never seen before, especially now that I'm in college. It's a never-ending journey that only gets more and more exciting.
Yeah, so I think if my Japanese ever fully caught up to my English, then it would probably feel like, okay, I'm learning 2 languages now, English and Japanese. Whereas now I want to improve at English, but I'm not like actively doing very much because Japanese is still like where I put most of my energy. But though, like you mentioned, I have like learned Mandarin on and off for a while, and it always ends up just coming back to me realizing that I want to get better at Japanese and I don't have enough time to spare, if we lived unlimited, like an unlimited amount of time, we're immortal, then I'd probably try to learn, 10 languages eventually. I think another final piece I'll say is that I also, like I said, I really like to take a growth mindset to everything I do. So I really don't like the idea of attrition in any way. And I know that if I learn multiple languages, I would end up inevitably dealing with attrition in some of my languages. And the idea of like, I'm working hard to get something up and then it's coming down and I have to get it back up again just doesn't really appeal to me. I want to try to structure my life in a way where I'm constantly growing in every area where I'm putting energy into, and that's just me personally. But yeah, what about you, being on the not the opposite end, but on more to the other side of the spectrum than me?
Well,
Especially, I'm curious what hearing kind of my perspective, what differs for you.
yeah, like you said, maintenance and attrition are the two biggest problems when it comes to learning multiple languages, especially if someone like catches you at a bad time. Like you say, you speak French and they say, oh, well, tell me how to say blah, 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 and you're like, ugh. But I think in a lot of cases, language attrition is misleading, because if you hear the word one more time, just in passing, like on a newspaper or in a TV show, then it'll instantly come back to you and you'll be able to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we think about how we communicate in English, we tend to reuse words that we've seen recently. Or if I use a more complicated
That's true.
word that we don't say too often, you are more likely to use that same word in the same
I've
conversation.
noticed that.
So I think it's something that we also experience in English, but we just have more words like stored in the bank that we can whip out in any given moment to the point where we don't really notice it. But for me, learning a bunch of languages has never been about like impressing people or having this party tricks or whatever else people think it is. It's always been about the people, and it always will be. And more specifically, foreign culture. Learning to speak a language isn't just about learning a bunch of words. You also need to learn the respective culture and how to sound natural, and question why they say it the way that they do, because it usually has something to do with their history or whatnot. Like, for example, Russian literature expresses a lot of suffering, like a lot of sorrow. In the best, what's considered to be the best Russian literature, like Dostoevsky, Pushkin, came from the same time period where suffering was pervasive. So culture is a reflection of the language. So it's always been about exploring other cultures and trying to understand other people for me. And I don't care if I can't hold a full conversation in Dutch about engineering or whatever else. I just want to speak to Dutch people and learn from where they come from, and hopefully teach them something about my culture, so we can spread a little more like mutual understanding and acceptance in the world. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. Well, it's almost kind of like, talking about this now, I've never had this thought until just now, but it's almost like I imagine most language learners from everywhere on the spectrum, if, like I said, we could be immortal, we'd probably want to learn a lot of languages and learn them all to the highest possible level. The only thing is, since we don't have that much time, we have to make sacrifices, and the only difference is what are we choosing to sacrifice based on our priorities, right? So we both, everyone everywhere on the spectrum probably wants both things, right? They want depth and breadth, but we're forced to choose. So that's the only difference, is like what we're choosing. But when you think about it that way, it makes us kind of feel more alike and more aligned than maybe it might seem at first. But one other kind of thing I'm curious about is, if kind of your number one priority in learning languages is connecting to other people, part of me wonders if not having an extremely high level of language ability might put a kind of glass ceiling somewhere, some kind of limit on how easy it is for you or how deep you can know somebody. Like, for example, having a philosophical conversation about like your philosophy of life. It's very abstract. It's very hard to, even in any language, right? It's sometimes going to be hard to have a clear communication about those types of ideas. It seems like, well, if you didn't have a really high level of language ability, would you be able to have that type of conversation? But if you can't have that kind of conversation of like, what do you think is the meaning of life to you? Tell me the most detailed nuances of what you think about in the middle of the night, then are you really getting to know them as deep as you could be,
Right, and you're completely right. But I've noticed that the majority of my encounters, whether it be on the street or on Omegle or whatever, aren't that deep in nature. But it's still enough to make a profound impact on the perception that person had on Americans, for example. Like, I always hear this every single time I make a video. Like, there aren't that many Americans that speak multiple languages. Americans aren't interested in learning about foreign people and culture, but that's a bunch of crap. There are a bunch of people here that are interested.
Yeah.
At it. So I don't don't think it takes a lot to really make a difference and to connect with someone on that level. Just saying hello, how are you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is enough for someone to think like, wow, it was their prerogative to kind of go out of their way and learn something about my culture, when instead they could just elect to be really comfortable within their own culture. Kind of like looking outwards and realizing like, wow, this person is interested in me and where I come from and what I have to say. Of course, if you want to have a philosophical conversation, it would require a really high level, but not as high of a level as people think. Like I think one thing that I've been trying to learn as I've been learning all of these languages is how do I become a more effective communicator? Because forgetting words, it'll happen no matter what. It's just something that you have to accept if you take on multiple languages. So I've been trying to learn, how do I get my point across in the least amount of words possible? And I think if you were to take on a topic like philosophy or politics, then you would be able to express yourself with, say, like a lower upper intermediate level, because you don't necessarily need all of the vocabulary in order to make your point come across.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. So that's kind of cool. That's definitely a perspective I wouldn't have had just going really deep on one language.
I'm happy to provide it.